Rebel by Bailey. The general came across the dusty plain of Burma in the early morning. He came with clanking tanks, wheeled guns, and creaking trucks, and long columns of crunching, hard-faced soldiers. They marched over the bridge, past the ancient pagoda and the quiet shops. They stopped outside the schoolyard. The general patted his hand with his baton and looked at the children and at the school. And the children inside the school looked at the general. The general pointed his baton and the tanks rolled over the school's fence. The children watched the tanks flatten the slides, the swings, and the monkey bars. Nobody spoke. The hard-faced soldiers spread through the town, kicking down doors and waving guns. They brought every person before the general. The general climbed onto a tank. He stroked his baton and nodded. The gold stars on his hat flashed in the sun. He rolled his shoulders so the rows of medals clinked proudly on his chest. He looked down at the townspeople and smiled at them. "You're my people now. I have the tanks and the soldiers, and you have nothing. I make all the laws, punish who I wish, and I tell you when to plant the rice and when to harvest it." Nobody spoke. "You'll give me half of everything you make, and at school the children will learn only of my heroic battles and my glorious victories." At that moment, a small, battered thong was flung from the school. It whirled past 3 wide-eyed washerwomen, flipped over a frightened fireman, skimmed over a sleepy sergeant, and hit the general behind the ear. The general's hat dipped onto his nose, bounced on the cannon of the tank, and flopped into the dust. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, everybody waited through a long and terrible silence. The children stared down at his hat in the dust and began to hiss. "What?" he roared, and struck his leg hard with the baton. He turned slowly to the school, his medals clicking, his mustache twitching. The sergeant darted forward, picking up the general's hat and the thong. "Who did that?" bellowed the general. There was no sound, no movement from the school. The sergeant furiously dusted that general's hat and polished the stars. The general snatched his hat from the sergeant and rammed it on his head. "I'll get the little rebel who attacked me and put him in the parrot's cage. I'll feed him pig's swill." The general saw the thong in the sergeant's hand and plucked it away. "Aha," he said. "Bring all the children outside. Find the child wearing only one thong, and drag him to me." The soldiers crunched into the school, waving their guns, and they lined up the children before the general. They stood straight as posts, the children and their teachers, and looked right past the general. The general looked at the children and glared. The hard-faced soldiers looked at the children and began to cough. Their hard faces began to twitch. The townspeople looked at the children and smiled and grinned. And somewhere, someone began to giggle. The general stood on his tank, tinkled his bells, shone his stars, and broke his baton. For in that school there was a large pile of thongs, and all the children and all the teachers had nothing at all on their feet. The general went past the tiny shops, past the ancient pagoda, and over the bridge. He went with clinking tanks and wheeled guns and creaking trucks, and long columns of marching, grinning soldiers. The general marched across the dusty plain of Burma in the late afternoon, but he could still hear the children laughing. And that's Rebel by Bailey.